Welcome to yet another episode of the Dynamic CIO. Now, I was reading an article where a CXO had mentioned digitization is fundamentally changing the way organizations engage with both their customers and workforce. Now, I was intrigued to read more articles about him, and he's a good friend, so I just decided to read more. And when I was reading articles more about him, I read a case study compendium, on innovation-led R&D, creating the next progressive world, and by Makers Lab, and was floored by the case studies mentioned. And just for information, Makers Lab is Tech Mahindra's innovation lab, spearheaded by him. It is responsible for innovation and co-innovation with various customers in telecom, healthcare, retail, and in many domains. And the key areas of the Makers Lab are machine learning, IoT, robotics, and microservices. Now, this is when I decided to reach out to him for an interview to know more about it, which he gladly agreed to. I'm so honored to have with me today Mr. Nikhil Malhotra, Chief Innovation Officer and creator of Makers Lab, a unique incubator space within Tech Mahindra. Welcome, Nikhil.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vidhi. It's a pleasure always to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, I will not take much of your time. Let me move straight into the questions that I have already prepared in my mind for you. So before we start, can you tell me more about your role as a Chief Innovation Officer and the creator of the Innovation Makers Lab in Tech?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think my role is to disrupt and to say what can we not see in the future. And I think there's a story behind it, Vidhi. My background has been largely into research, where I first joined IBM and then joined TechM as a services organization. I came back to India in 2014, possibly because the culture was ripe, the government had changed, and there was a lot of talk of startups, and I actually wanted to do a startup of my own. But somehow my CEO convinced me, saying, look, we can actually set up a kind of R&D lab. And I think the premise behind the R&D lab, or the sector that we want to set up as innovation, is a lot of times we think about the what and the how, and that's true in terms of solving problems, but largely the why part is definitely missed by us. And I've always had one vision in my mind, and that vision has been, can humans and machines collaborate better together? And that was the cultural set behind which, and that was the vision behind which I set up the Makers Lab. Now, when you've talked about a lot of the areas that we look at, I would only give you three vectors in terms of what we are trying to do within the lab. I think number one is, when we talk about AI, the whole cultural set of AI is changing. The tech is changing itself. Up till now, you have been looking at AI, which really looks at the inferences or predictive measures or discriminative AI. I think the AI is today changing into a generative mode, where we can actually generate more systems, right? So creating more 3D content, creating more valuation in terms of art, creating even paragraphs of what AI could learn. I think AI has done significantly well. What AI has not done well over the past years is, even though it evolved or it originated from the human brain, it has not taken the human brain sector in terms of what it should do. And we do it very, very differently. The way human brain runs. So one of the vectors of change that we think is that neuroscience should come in and inspire AI to do much better. And I have hundreds and thousands of examples, and I would not go into examples of what AI has done better. I would rather go into examples which AI has not done better as well. And you can give any occluded kind of an image to AI today. Now, and one of the images that we continue to talk about is an unfortunate incident that happened in Venice at one point, when it was all underwater. If you look at that photograph, you would, as a human being, understand that there are tables, chairs, even ducks and swans in the city on the water. But the AI really fails because it cannot see the occlusion part of it. And I think that's something that we are trying to bring in. What value of human brain can we bring in into this system? Second vector of change that we think and we are very, very gung-ho about is graphics computing. I think now organizations need to think about their portfolios in 3D, if I may say so, rather than the 2D. We have always looked at the screen and we've looked at 2D aspects of it, but spatially, we have not looked at things that are going into the system. So we've got to start thinking about 3D, and that's where the whole ideology of metaverse really comes in. TechM has also launched into TechMverse and some of those things, but those are elements which are the second facet which are coming in into tech. The third is the compute power. We all need compute power to do this. What better than to pick up the universe itself to compute our own problems and classical problems that we face. And the third vector that we think is going to change is the quantum computing facet. So while the lab was developed in 2014, it looked at AI, it looked at robotics, it looked at IoT. we do believe that after 7 or 8 years, the color of the tech has certainly changed into these three vectors. The fourth, obviously, being the connectivity facet, where Tech Mahindra is involved, which includes 5G and some of the other things. So that's my role. My role is to look at some of these upcoming technologies, of course, prototype them, get into research and development, both fundamental and applied in the lab, and then getting into getting into solving problems for customer, but also for society as well. Right? So some of these
seems a very daunting task. You spoke about the three vectors and the fourth one, connectivity, and your whole role from, I like the perspective of what you said. We should look at what AI cannot do. Yeah. Instead of, we always, when we speak to CXOs, we always put what has been done in AI, what are you doing in AI, etc., etc. I like the perspective. Look at it from what AI cannot do and then work on it. So yeah, I think that's a great takeaway for my community. Now we're living in that era where, man-machine collaboration and coordination is helping a lot of human, environmental, and societal problems. Yep. So what is the new definition of innovation? How has it changed or transformed after the disruption, especially after the prolonged pandemic, which never seems to be ending?
No, I think that's a great question. And I think I'd love to answer it in this way, Smriti. I think the new definition of innovation is how can we make this collaboration much more better? We've always collaborated with machines, but it has always been a one-way journey where human beings have been involved in telling the machines what to do, and machines have been doing this. And this is what we call as the procedural way of life. We've always been procedural, but we've never received a feedback from the machine saying whether this was right or not, or maybe they could give back a different valuation or different value to what we're doing. So I think that's changing with innovation. Now we are actually looking at, number one, sectoral growth in terms of what a constant feedback mechanism between human beings and machine has to evolve. And that is what will make our lives better. And that is also what will make, humanity in a much more, or will take humanity in a much more better direction. Number one. Number two, for the first half or the first growth of internet, right from it started in 1995 to today, we have actually seen it very sparsely connected to people, right? Some people know it, some people don't know it. And one of the challenges has been languages in terms of what we deal with machine. I think that also needs to now change. I think there's a larger connect. And specifically talking about India, if you look at India, most innovations happen in Bharat, not in India. And the reason for that is because most problems occur in Bharat. And we need to give an ability to people who are trying to solve these problems, the idea of tech, or the tech needs to come to their hands as well. You already know this. We started this language called Bhamal, which is Bharat Markup Language, which enables kids to code in their language. That's just very preliminary attempt on that part, saying that now the ecosystem of technology needs to grow, not just from Indian point of view or the urban sector point of view. It has to now go into tier 2, tier 3 cities and even rural sectors where we can come in. So these two facets are changing the innovation because we are getting more use cases. We are looking at more problems that needed to be solved. It is not as if once we created a model and it solved a problem in the urban sector, this solves a problem for a larger population of India or a larger populace of India or of the other parts of the world. We are actually seeing that these use cases may need a warrant a change in the entire tech and also the change in the entire process of thinking. Today, my 8-year-old goes to birthday parties on a Roblox. The pandemic seems to be over. Kids are now meeting, but they still want to meet in Roblox because that's what the younger generation is demanding today. And I think most of the kids are doing this today. So that change in mindset, the change in inclusivity of technology, the change in what we think about tech, and I'd like to call it the color of tech is changing. The color of tech is changing, and that's driving the larger innovative force for us. So we don't know where these use cases come from, but when they come, they solve a much larger challenge to what we have seen before.
I think a lot of, adding to what you said about the language, and also a lot of, especially the BFSI companies or the service companies are looking at a lot of language, including in their conversational chatbots, etc., just for the ease. And as you said, the tech is changing color. And if you have to reach the rural market, you cannot say X, Y, Z is my strategy for urban, and I will, a control C, control V in rural, which will not happen.
Absolutely. It does not happen.
Yeah, and with India being such a diverse country with so many languages and the different kind of people, I think
we're seeing diversity even across the board, Smriti. What we are seeing is we're seeing diversity, let's say, in countries like Australia. In countries like US themselves, they have always looked at English as a language, but there's Spanish as well, which is spoken. Now there is an Indian population that needs to be catered to. UK, for example, has loads of these. So we are also seeing that this is an impact not just in India. This is an effect it's just a global effect that the color of the tech is changing. Now we want to have more inclusivity in terms of people.
Okay. Now, as I said, I was completely blown out with your Makers Lab case study compendium, where you have said, and I would quote you as is, trust is a two-way street and technology has a big role to play. Correct? We are very keen. Now, I'm very keen to understand the meaning of trust in this age of, when we're talking about hyper digitization and augmentation. How does trust work in building a great tech, a great society, and maybe a great future?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. I think I'm barraged by great questions today from you. I think one of the things that is changing is it's that human-centered approach, Smriti, when we say that the moment you are born, the first people that you trust are your parents, and whatever your parents say seem to be the gospel truth before you actually take out yourself in the world and you say, look, the world is different. And there was a part of it, but you do carry that education factor from what your parents told you, saying that, look, they told me this is how this has changed. There is a certain bit of a trust. And when I talk to you today, there's a certain bit of a trust between you and me. And there's a certain bit of integrity between you and me. The questions that you're asking and the response has to be truthful. You have to publish it in a truthful fashion, so on and so forth. That trust was somehow lost in the middle because of the way tech was advancing. And one of the primary reasons for that tech and that trust getting lost was AI, obviously, because AI generates itself on a large perspective of data that it has seen. And as a result of that, there are a lot of biases that come in. Even today, if I ask an AI, very generic AIs that I give a question saying, if doctor is equal to male, nurse is equal to, the response typically would be a female. And that bias has been built in that data. There's nothing wrong with the technology. There's obviously wrong with the data that we have actually fed into the system. Now, this trust also lies itself in certain use cases when people are trying to get, let's say, credit cards, they're trying to get loans. These biases actually play a larger part in terms of what technology is producing for them. That is the facet of trust which we want to establish with tech. And that was my whole purpose. Whatever tech that we build in has to be, number one, available at all times for me to talk, has to be transparent. Why did I make that decision? And you would find these questions from a lot of CEOs and CXOs from different companies saying, look, the AI gave me the answer, but should I trust it? Should I say that this is the right answer? Because my human nature may produce a very different answer for me. That's number two, which is basically transparency of information, which is produced in front of by these machines. Number three is accountability. Am I accountable for what I did just now? And when I talk about accountability, it's not human accountability. That comes secondary. The tech has to be accountable, saying what I produced has to have an accountable nature to the human being that I'm actually giving this answer to. And the human accountability from our side, because we are techies, is that whatever tech we make has to ensure that these 3 or 4 paradigms are solved from them. So it's kind of a hypocritic oath that you may take as a techie, that whatever tech I make has to follow these principles so that it is beneficial for not just the business, but also beneficial for society at large, so that, we have that trust. So that's where we are reaching out at this point. We are seeing tech grow at a massive rate, but we are not seeing trust grow at a massive rate. And I think one of the reasons that we want to do, and people call it by different names, they call it ethical usage of technology, ethical AI, and so on and so forth. But it's in general, can tech become accountable? Can tech become transparent? Can it have the integrity that we humans have when we talk to each other? When that's our purpose that we look at, right? Making tech more. And that was the statement that I made.
When you spoke about the hypocrite oath, the first thing which came in my mind is the frontline workers. And very frankly, digitization and technology have become a must-have in this, especially after the pandemic. Yeah. And that's when I was speaking to one of the CTOs. I would not want to name him, but I spoke to him and I said, I also think that CTOs, CIOs, all of you who are handling the tech are also one of the kind of frontline workers who are there to ensure that everything is on track, much better. Everything is reachable. You're just being the frontline worker and making the ends meet for the society at large. So I think kudos to all the frontline workers. And when I say, it includes the innovation officers and the technology officers as well. So yes, the frontline workers have to be entrusted with a lot of trust, and I think we do have that. So yeah. Speaking of more, you spoke about one vector called quantum computing. Now the fabric of IT is undergoing a revolutionary change, and we've been hearing robotics, quantum computing, blockchain, AI, etc. Now we have the usual use cases, right? What are the exceptional cases, if you can share, some of the exceptional cases that Tech Mahindra's Innovation Makers Lab is working on, which will have a deeper impact on shaping the businesses and societies?
Yeah. So I think some of the exceptional use cases that we're looking at, and specifically from these three vectors and from quantum computing, is we are actually trying to figure out whether fraud optimization can be done better for banks, and that can include quantum. The reason for this is, and let me go back a little bit and revert back and say, we've solved a lot of problems in the world using computing, and we have solved a lot of issues with tech. There are certain classical issues which are still unsolved. And I can give you hundreds of examples. Number one, the typical traveling salesman problem is still not solved. People would say that they've solved it, but still I cannot figure that if I give you a bag and I ask you as to do sales across the country and come back to the same point, what is the amount of route and what is the route that you take? It's a very, very difficult proposition. The probabilities are infinite. Number two, very simply, if I just have 20 people in a room and I want to arrange them in terms of their relationships, their characteristics, etc., it is almost as much as 20 factorial, the amount of value that I would take. Those problems are also coming up in terms of healthcare and life sciences. If you look at the current machines today, even the supercomputers, we can only model very small little formulas and chemical formulas today. For example, we can model caffeine, which is chai, but the human body is composed of almost a barrage of amino acids, which is constructed from base 20. If we want to increase healthcare, if we want to make sure that we give personalized medicine, we've got to know how the body or how a specific body is reacting to a specific drug. And then our biggest example has been COVID-19 that has come up, where we have actually gone ahead to understand what drugs could be, how could therapeutic medicines could be, and how could these facets could be. So that is prompting us to change this level of tech in terms of quantum. But some of the use cases that we have been doing, number one, we have actually done a specific use case, as people know that we were the ones to find out a therapeutic molecule against COVID-19 that was actually using AI, a specific kind of AI, and also with our partners, where AI was able to filter out 8,000 FDA drugs, but they were also able to replace it they were able to test it in vitro to say that this is the molecule that attacks COVID-19. Another interesting thing that we are doing is with Panchang, Indian Panchang. And we've actually figured out, and you've read it in our story as well, where we are actually trying to see whether precipitation values can be figured out much more easier and better. I know NVIDIA has launched out a new algorithm to find out precipitation value at 95% accuracy. We are also looking at, from an old Indian science perspective, of our own algorithm to say whether precipitation values are better, because this will help us in climate change. This will help us know what's happening to the winds, so on and so forth. And that's one of the things that we are essentially doing with our customers. What we are doing with our customers, very interesting use case. We are trying to actually model and generate sentences based on AI in certain cases where there is not possible. So let's say if I give you a document, can you model a multiple choice questions and have better distractors over there? This is another use case that we are doing. We're also doing some robotics use cases where we are essentially saying how robots and machines can cooperate and coordinate together. You also know we have the chess league. We are trying to say whether chess league can actually open up in the metaverse in some way or the other, and some of these use cases. There are loads of use cases that we are doing in terms of tech. With us.
Yeah, that's why I said I was floored by the use case. When I read about Panchang and how you are instead of taking the Panchang, the Hindu calendar. So I want to make a request to you. When I publish this, I would want to give the link of the case study document, so that I'm sure many of our community members have gone through it, but for the benefit of those who have not gone through it, I will seek your permission and give that link, so that I think it's a lot of beneficial and a lot of learnings from that case study that you have compiled.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. One more question. If I have to ask you, like a best practice or anything to tell to organizations who are still stuck with, very rudimentary and piecemeal approach to technology implementation, could you suggest any best practices?
The best practice is given in my book, which is courage. So, and I'll actually give you, that's also the practice that we follow at Makers Lab, but that's also the practice we follow generally in TechM. I think C stands for collaboration and communication. Do collaborate, do communicate. I think that's one of the best practices that we've found out. And we found out so many challenges by only collaboration and communication. Kids come to us. We also do a kidathon where we have I'm trying to make an advisory board between 13 to 17-year-old kids because they are our customers at the end. And the kind of challenges that they pose us are very different from what challenges we would have thought or envisioned, because that's a very different new world that they actually look from. The O stands for objectification. I think I learned it the hard way when I started the lab in 2014. Unless you objectify technology, unless you ensure that technology will eventually be beneficial to a human being, there is no point in having that tech. It's just basically a passe as a tech if you don't objectify it. So it has to impact somebody. It has to impact it may be smaller portions, it may be larger portions of people and population, but do objectify it. You is actually you, Smriti, right? So we say that you are the maker. You're the maker of not just your destiny, but you're also the maker of tech. All you need to do is get into tech. The R is basically rewiring your psyche, and we say that the heart continues to pump blood 24/7. It's the brain that requires constant rewiring. Now, my principle has been, whenever you want to touch base and change a culture within an organization, or you want to change, let's say, the facet of what you do next, please don't think from the mind, think from the heart. Because I think that is one empathetic organ that connects you with the human beings. So you've got to follow that principle of what does the heart really say. I know you've got to have a balancing act of the mind of how commercialization would happen, but I think the heart really tells the right thing, that this seems right. And I think that is something which we follow in the R. The A is something as a principle we follow in Makers Lab: ask stupid questions every day. We know the answer, but we have a tendency to ask every time a stupid question. The reason is it tends to simplify a complex thing. So if we can develop that structure within the organization to keep asking questions, it may be right, it may be wrong. People may frown at you. Look, this was the answer already given. Why did you ask that question again? I think it just simplifies that concept if you keep on asking those questions. The G is, of course, goals that people follow. The E is one thing which is very different from what an organization possibly teaches you. And the E is empathize with your customer. We call it empathize with yourself first. It's like getting into a plane and the air hostess telling you, please put on your mask beforehand, before you help an infant or somebody else. You've got to empathize with yourself. In our culture, we actually do a lot of compromises. I think we've got to get out of that compromise and say, look, I can do it. I have the ability to do it. And that is where, even when you get into potholes of despair, you know that that E will actually bring you up, and you have to constantly remind yourself, look, I have the power to do it. If that change structurally happens in the culture of the organization, you would find that every organization becomes a little bit more innovative than where they are. I'm not saying that you could become the pinnacle of innovation, but there's a change in that set of culture that happens when you apply these principles. So that's what we apply. So
I think the courage best practice is a takeaway, and best practice for all organizations, not only for organizations who are being rudimentary or having a piecemeal approach. I think it is, and this takeaway I'm going to share it with my organization as well. So
yeah, and the byproduct is it allows us to overcome failures and actually turn failures into a term called feedback. Well, that's the byproduct. And we've got loads of failures. We have loads of failures. As a human being also, we fail a lot of times. Even during our jobs, we fail a lot of times. I think this facet of courage really allows you to overcome that failure and say, look, this was a feedback for me. Let me go ahead again, right? It's the first step that you take.
I think it's well articulated, the courage, So I'm coming back again and again to the Makers Lab campus connectivity. It was fascinating to read about it. Just one question. It's the last question, so I won't take much of your time. What was the objective of it? And a little bit about the StartNet program?
Yeah. So Campus Connect was basically connecting the campus and getting to know what the minds of today are thinking, they're reading. One of the things that we do in Campus Connect is connect with almost all universities across the board in India, but also abroad. And we actually sometimes train students in terms of problem statements, practical issues that are coming in. But we also get to know from them what are they thinking. I think it's more of an uptake for us rather than them. Interns think that they're getting trained with Makers Lab. The perspective that we have is that we are getting trained from them to understand what do they think about this, right? So I think it's for our betterment that we did this, and I think we wanted to be better, and we've gone even below campus. As I told you, we have 13 to 17-year-olds come to our labs and say what's happening, what's going on, and give their ideas. The other thing that we do with Campus Connect is we sometimes also formulate curriculums. We are responsible for AICTE curriculum for for the country, where we say what computing could be and how could computing change, and we were principal architects of how that curriculum could be written. From StartNet perspective, it's just a transition from that ecosystem of campuses to a young person opening up a startup. So we have those startup connects. So StartNet was a program where we combine startups, we look at their problem statement, we sometimes help them. A large point of times, they help us to actually say where they are going and what's a use case. I think one of the other things that we found with StartNet was that most of the startups are very, very particular in terms of what they're doing, right? And they're very centered at one specific point. Whereas from an organization perspective, I have to look at large number of vectors from a customer. So we can tell the startup as to they can evolve their solution in such fashion or not. And there are brilliant young people who are doing a lot of good work in terms of what they are trying to tackle as a problem. I've got a young kid, and when I say young kid, he's actually a young kid. He's just 18, and he's actually opened up a startup which basically talks about certain problems in the lungs when you actually take an X-ray report, and he's converted it into an AI system. I've got another young kid, and they are all in terms of Atal incubation centers that they are based, who's actually done an interesting work. He says, can I make a replica of your memory in terms of a 3D system? So remember, you got married and you had one of your most favorite songs played between you and your husband, or let's say you and your wife and spouse. Can I capture that song, that sound, and can I create it into a 3D object? Right? And that 3D object, you can wear it, you can keep it as a memorabilia, but that carries the sound waves of what you did when you actually got married. So that's a memorabilia for you. It's not just in pictures, it's not digital, it's also physical in terms of what you think. So there's some very, very peculiar cases that people are coming up with, right? And that's what we do in StartNet. We connect with startups.
Amazing. I mean, I can't even imagine thinking something like this would ever come into reality. So I know you spoke about especially you started with, please focus on AI, what AI doesn't do. You spoke about the 3 vectors, you spoke about constant feedback, how the color of the tech is changing, and you spoke about some of the use cases in your case studies, and the best practices, courage, which I have a great takeaway for my community and myself and my organization. So thank you so much, Nikhil, for this. I think it was wonderful, and I can keep asking you questions over and over again. But thank you so much for this. This was so enriching and so intriguing.
It's a pleasure always, Priti. It's a pleasure always.